A drone operator found something shiny underwater. It solved a 15-year-old case. The water at Blackheart Quarry didn't move. It was a slab of polished obsidian, so still and dark it seemed to swallow the summer sky whole. Leo hated the place. It felt like a wound in the earth that had never healed, festering under the oppressive Georgia humidity. The air, thick as a wet blanket, was alive with the drone of cicadas, a high or ceaseless thrum that vibrated in his teeth and skull. He'd been coming here for a week, not for the grim, local legend ambience, but because it was the only place, within a 20-mile radius of his mother's suffocating house, where no one would bother him. No one to ask if he'd applied for more jobs. No one to look at his 32-year-old face with the soft, pitying eyes that said failure. His drone, a DJI Mavic 3 he'd bought with the last of his severance pay, was his only escape. It was a sleek, grey insect of a thing, and as it climbed into the heavy air, its worry blades were a clean, mechanical sound against the swampy chorus of nature. On the screen of his controller, the world transformed. The festering quarry became a dramatic landscape of rust-colored cliffs and emerald-green pines. He was a god up here, a silent observer floating above the world's messy details. He pushed the sticks forward, sending the drone skimming low across the treeline, the camera capturing the dance of pine needles in the rotor wash. He was a filmmaker, without a film, a pilot without a destination. He guided the drone out over the center of the quarry. The water, from this height, was even more unnerving. It wasn't the blue of a healthy lake or the murky brown of a river. It was a dead, depthless, black. The local kids told stories about it being bottomless, a straight shaft to hell. They said it was so full of abandoned mining equipment and toxic minerals that nothing could live in it. Nothing except secrets. Leo was just playing, testing the gimbal's smoothness as he panned the camera down, until it was staring directly into the abyss. The sun, a molten ball in the west, was angled just right, and its light pierced the water's surface for a few feet before being extinguished. He was about to pull up, board, when he saw it. A flashdot. It was tiny, a momentary glint of something artificial in a world of organic decay. It wasn't the silvery flash of a fish. Had there been any, this was a hard, metallic gleam, like a dropped coin. His curiosity, a muscle long atrophied, gave a faint twitch. He lowered the drone, dropping its altitude from 50 feet to 10, the rotors now just inches from the water's glassy skin. The downdraft created a circular pattern of ripples on the surface, distorting the view. "Come on, you bastard," he muttered, his thumb nudging the control stick with a surgeon's delicacy. He angled the camera, using the polarized filter to cut through the glare. The ripples subsided as he held the drone in a perfect hover, and there it was again. Not just a flash, but a shape. Something long and angular, submerged in the gloom. It was pale, coated in a fine layer of silt and algae, but it was unmistakably man-made. He pushed the digital zoom, the image pixelating, losing clarity but gaining a horrifying significance. It was a line, a straight line, the top edge of a car door. His breath hitched. The air in his lungs turned to ice. It wasn't a story, it wasn't a legend, it was real. Everyone in Red Oak, Georgia, knew the story of Elara Vance, 15 years ago. She had driven away from her high school graduation party in her father's vintage Ford Falcon, and had simply vanished from the face of the earth. She was 17, the town's golden girl, the valedictorian, the one who was supposed to get out and make something of herself. There were searches, of course. Weeks of them. Volunteers combing the woods, police dragging the rivers, but they never dragged Blackheart Quarry. The official reason was that it was too dangerous. The depths littered with submerged cables and jagged machinery that would snag any equipment. The unofficial reason was that no one wanted to look too closely. At the quarry, it was the town's dark place, and some things were better left buried. Leo's heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He was looking at her tomb. After 15 years of silence, he was staring into her tomb. The drone felt less like a toy now, and more like a sacrilegious instrument, a violation of a long-settled peace. His hands were slick with sweat, his fingers trembling on the controls. He had to be sure. He needed a better look. He took a deep, shuddering breath and maneuvered the drone, moving it laterally, trying to find a better angle, a clearer patch of water. The car was deeper than he first thought, maybe 20 feet down. It was resting on a submerged ledge, which was probably why it hadn't sunk into the fabled bottomless depths. It was tilted, the driver's side angled slightly upward, which was why the sun had caught it. He zoomed in again, this time on the driver's side window. It was halfway down, a black square of deeper darkness, and then he saw the second glint. It was different from the first, smaller, more intense. It came from inside that black square, from the edge of the open window. It was a tiny, brilliant star in the underwater night. He focused the camera, his knuckles white on the controller. The image swam, then sharpened. It was a chain. A delicate silver chain, caught on the window frame. And at the end of the chain, nestled in the silt on the dashboard, was a locket. A small, heart-shaped locket, Ilara's locket. It was in every picture of her from that last year of her life. A gift from her grandmother. It was the one detail her mother, broken and hollowed out by grief, had repeated over and over to the police, to the local news, to anyone who would listen. She never took it off, never. Find the locket, and you'll find my baby. Leo felt a wave of nausea. The thick, humid air was suddenly unbreathable. He was looking at the answer to a 15-year-old prayer, a confirmation of a mother's worst nightmare. The injustice of it all crashed down on him. 15 years. 15 years this car had sat here, a few hundred yards from the main road, while a family disintegrated. While a town wove the tragedy into its foundational myth. The power of this place, its ability to keep a secret of this magnitude, felt like a physical presence, a malevolent intelligence. He, a broke, aimless nobody, had stumbled upon a truth that had been deliberately and successfully buried. He hit the record button. The small red light blinked on his controller. He filmed it all. The long shot of the quarry, the slow, dreadful descent, the reveal of the car's roofline, the zoom into the dark interior, the final heartbreaking focus on the silver heart hanging in the gloom. He held the shot for a full minute, the drone's battery indicator flashing a nervous yellow. He knew this footage was everything. It was the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of an earthquake that would shatter the foundations of his quiet, forgotten town. His mind raced. Who did he call? The local sheriff, a man named Brody who had been a deputy back then. A man whose folksy charm always seemed to Leo to be a little too practiced, a little too smooth. Or did he go to the state police? To the news? He felt a profound sense of dread, a fear that was deeper than just the discovery. He was holding a truth that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. Unburying it would not be a simple matter. The drone's battery alarm beeped. A shrill, insistent warning. Critical, he had to bring it home. He began to ascend, the car shrinking, the locket vanishing, the water's surface becoming an impenetrable mirror once more. As the drone rose above the tree line, he glanced across the quarry, his eyes sweeping the opposite cliff face, now bathed in the fiery orange of the setting sun. And his blood ran cold. There was a figure standing there. A man, a silhouette against the blazing sky. He was perfectly still, watching. Not watching the sunset, watching him. The distance was too great to make out any features, but the posture was unmistakable. It was a posture of ownership, of authority. This was his place. Leo's hands flew over the controls, bringing the drone in fast. It landed with a soft thud in the red dirt at his feet. He didn't take his eyes off the figure. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He had been so focused on what was in the water, he hadn't thought to look at who might be on the land. How long had he been standing there? Had he seen the drone hover? Had he guessed what it had found? Then, the figure moved. He raised a hand to his face. For a terrifying second, Leo thought it was a rifle. But then the dying sun caught a glint of glass. Binoculars. The man had been watching his every move. He lowered the binoculars, and even from a quarter-mile away, Leo felt the weight of that gaze. It was a look of cold, final assessment. He fumbled with his equipment, shoving the drone and controller into his backpack. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely work the zippers. He had to get out of there. He had to get to his car and drive. He slung the backpack over his shoulder and risked one last glance at the cliff. The figure was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. But the space he had occupied seemed to burn in the air, an afterimage of pure menace. The cicadas buzzed, the air hung thick and heavy, but the silence from the opposite cliff was louder than any sound. It was the silence of a predator who has marked his prey. Leo scrambled up the dirt path toward the road, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He had the footage, he had the truth, but as he burst through the trees and saw his beat-up Honda Civic, a chilling realization settled over him. The secret wasn't just in the water anymore, it was out, and it wasn't just Ellara's secret. It was his, and the man on the cliff knew it. The weight of the backpack felt impossibly heavy, not with the plastic and wires of a drone, but with the cold, hard burden of a 15-year-old ghost and the dangerous attention of the man who had put her there. He had thought he was a god, an observer floating above it all. He knew now he was just a man, standing on the edge of a grave he had just accidentally opened. And something had just crawled out. The drive back to his mother's house was a blur of paranoid glances in the rearview mirror. Every pair of headlights behind him was a threat, every shadow on the side of the road a potential ambush. The familiar, sleepy streets of Red Oak now seemed sinister, the quaint storefronts hiding watchful eyes. He parked in the driveway, the crunch of gravel under his tires sounding like a gunshot in the quiet evening. Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish and regret. His mother was in the living room, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the television. A half-empty glass of white wine on the end table beside her. "You were out late," she said, her voice soft, but with an edge of accusation. "I was starting to worry." "Just flying," he said, his own voice sounding hollow and distant to his ears. He couldn't tell her, not yet. He couldn't bring the monster he'd found at the quarry into this fragile, quiet house. He went straight to his childhood bedroom. The walls still adorned with faded posters of bands that had long since broken up. He locked the door, his back pressing against it as if to keep the whole world out. He pulled the drone's memory card, his fingers clumsy, and slid it into the reader on his laptop. The video files appeared on the screen, innocuous little icons that held a universe of pain. He clicked on the last one. The footage filled the screen. The slow, terrible descent. The car, the locket. It was all there, undeniable and clear. He watched it again, and then a third time, his mind struggling to process the enormity of it. This little piece of plastic. In his hand was a key, and it unlocked a door that had been sealed for 15 years. But what lay behind that door? Justice, or just more darkness? His thoughts kept returning to the man on the cliff. The silhouette was burned into his memory. There was a confidence to his stance, a chilling stillness. This was not a man who was afraid of being discovered. This was a man who was angry at being disturbed. Who in this town had that kind of authority, that kind of arrogance? Who could make a car and a girl disappear and then stand guard over their grave for a decade and a half? The name that came to him was one that had been whispered back then, a name quickly silenced by money and influence. A name that had been nowhere near the official investigation. Judge Harmon, the town's patriarch, a man whose family had practically built Red Oak from the ground up. His son, a handsome, reckless boy named Trent, had been obsessed with Ellara Vance. Everyone knew it. He'd been at the party that night. He'd been furious when she'd turned him down, publicly and humiliatingly, just hours before she vanished. But Trent Harmon was untouchable. His father's power was absolute, a gravitational force that bent the laws of justice and truth around him. The whispers had died, and Trent had gone off to some fancy college, then law school, and was now a successful lawyer in Atlanta. A world away from the ghosts of Red Oak. Could it have been him? The figure on the cliff? It was impossible to say, but the thought sent a fresh wave of fear through Leo. This wasn't just about solving a cold case. This was about confronting a dynasty. He, Leo, with his failed career and his hobbyist drone, versus the Harmons. It was a power imbalance so vast it was laughable. It was a death sentence. He copied the video file to a secure cloud server, encrypting it with a password he would never forget. He then dragged the original file to the trash and emptied it. He ejected the memory card and, using a pair of pliers from his old model building kit, snapped the tiny card in two. It was a futile gesture, he knew. The real evidence was now digital, ethereal. And yet it felt like the most dangerous object he had ever touched. He sat in the dark for a long time, the only light coming from the laptop screen, which now showed his empty desktop. The silence of the house pressed in on him. He could hear the faint murmur of the television downstairs, the gentle sigh of the house settling. It was a world of fragile peace, and he was about to set a bomb off in the middle of it. The cliffhanger wasn't just that he'd been seen, the cliffhanger was his life. From this moment on, every choice he made, every person he trusted, could be his last. The shiny object in the water had pulled him under, and now he was in the cold, dark depths with the ghosts. And the monsters were circling above. The ghost had a name, Ilara Vance, but to her mother, Amelia, she was not a ghost, she was a perpetual, present tense. Ilara is coming home. Ilara is just lost. Ilara is waiting to be found. For 15 years, Amelia Vance had lived in a house that was a shrine, a museum to a life interrupted. Ilaros' bedroom was untouched. The bed made, a stack of college brochures still on the desk. Her cheerleading uniform hung in a plastic garment bag on the closet door, the bright red and white A-slash of defiant life in the dusty silence. Amelia moved through her days in a fog of determined hope that had long ago curdled into a form of madness. She still set a place for Ilara at the dinner table every night. Amelia was a wraith. A woman whittled down by grief until only the sharp angles of her bones and the fierce, burning light in her eyes remained. She worked part-time at the town library, a job that allowed her to be surrounded by stories without having to engage with the real world. She spoke to people in polite, hushed tones, but her eyes were always distant, scanning the street outside the window, as if expecting to see a vintage Ford Falcon pull up to the curb at any moment. The townspeople treated her with a careful, pitying reverence. They called her a saint for her unwavering faith, but, in private, they whispered that the tragedy had broken something essential in her mind. They didn't understand that her hope was not a delusion, it was a weapon. It was the only thing she had left to fight the suffocating silence that had swallowed her daughter. Her antagonist was not a person, but a presence. It was the Harmon family, and the embodiment of that presence was Judge Alistair Harmon. He was a man carved from granite and old money, his face a mask of stern benevolence that barely concealed a core of absolute control. He lived in a sprawling, white-columned mansion on the hill overlooking the town, a constant reminder of his family's dominance. The judge didn't rule Red Oak with an iron fist. He didn't have to. He ruled it with favors, with history, with the unspoken understanding that every road, every business, every career in the county was connected to him in some way. He was the town's benefactor and its gatekeeper. 15 years ago, when Ilara vanished, Judge Harmon had been the picture of civic concern. He had personally funded a large portion of the search efforts. He had stood beside Amelia at press conferences, his hand on her shoulder, his deep, resonant voice assuring the community that no stone would be left unturned. But all the while, he had been expertly, quietly, turning stones over, burying the one lead that mattered, his own son. Trent Harmon, back then, was the town's dark prince, blessed with his father's sharp intelligence and his mother's careless beauty. He moved through life with a swaggering, reckless entitlement. He wanted Ilara Vance with a possessive, all-consuming obsession that she did not return. Ilara, with her bright mind and her dreams of a world beyond Red Oak, saw Trent for what he was, a gilded cage. She had politely rebuffed him for months, but at the graduation party, fueled by champagne and the triumph of her valedictorian speech, she had finally lost her patience. The scene, witnessed by a dozen of their classmates, had become the stuff of hushed legend. Trent had cornered her by the bonfire, his handsome face twisted with frustration. "Come on, Alara," he'd slurred, grabbing her arm. "Stop playing games, you and me. It's inevitable." Alara had pulled her arm away, her voice clear and cold, cutting through the party chatter. "The only thing that's inevitable, Trent, is that you'll still be here in 20 years, a big fish in a tiny, stagnant pond, and I'll be long gone. We have nothing in common." The public humiliation had shattered his arrogant facade. His face had gone pale, then blotchy with rage. He'd spat a single venomous word at her. "Whore." Then he had stormed off into the darkness. 2 hours later, Alara got into her father's falcon and drove away. She was never seen again. The hidden witness was a man named Garrett Hobbs. Back then, Garrett had been a scrawny, nervous kid who worked for Judge Harmon's landscaping company. He was invisible, the kind of person a man like Trent Harmon would never even register. On the night of the party, Garrett had been sent to the Harmon estate to fix a broken sprinkler head on the long, winding driveway that led up to the mansion. It was late, after midnight. He was finishing up, hidden in the shadows of a massive magnolia tree, when he heard a car coming up the drive, too fast. It wasn't one of the judge's sedate Lincolns, it was a Ford Falcon, the same one he'd seen Alara Vance driving all year. But it wasn't Alara behind the wheel. It was Trent. He screeched to a halt near the garages at the back of the house, the engine cutting out abruptly. Garrett froze in the shadows, his heart pounding. He knew he shouldn't be there. Trent got out of the car. He was frantic, his movements jerky and panicked. He ran to the passenger side and pulled the door open. Alara was slumped in the seat. She wasn't moving. Garrett's breath caught in his throat. Trent grabbed her under the arms and tried to pull her out. Her head lolled back at an unnatural angle, her long blonde hair spilling over the seat. In the cold white glare of the security light, Garrett saw a dark stain on the front of her pale blue graduation dress, and he saw her locket, the silver heart. Glinting against the darkness of the stained dot, just then, the back door of the mansion opened, and Judge Harmon stepped out. He wasn't wearing his judicial robes. He was in a silk dressing gown, but he carried himself with the same unassailable authority. He took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. His panicked son, the girl in the car, the blood. His face, for a fraction of a second, showed a flicker of something shock, maybe even horror. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of cold, hard resolve. He didn't shout. His voice was low, almost conversational, but it sliced through the night air with the chilling precision of a scalpel. "Get her in the house, now, and for God's sake, get the car out of the light." Trent seemed to crumble with relief at the sound of his father's voice. "I didn't mean to. She wouldn't listen. She was laughing at me. I just shook her." "Not another word," the judge commanded, his voice dropping even lower, a venomous hiss. "Not here. Get it done." Garrett watched, paralyzed with fear, as Trent, now following his father's orders with a desperate obedience, dragged Ilara's limp body from the car and into the house. The judge stood on the porch for a moment, his gaze sweeping the manicured lawns and the dark woods beyond, his eyes seeming to pierce the very shadows where Garrett was hiding. Garrett felt a terror so profound it was like a physical blow. He was certain he'd been seen. He didn't wait to see what they did with the car. He scrambled through the hedges, ran through the woods, and didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his own shabby little house on the other side of town. He never told a soul. He couldn't. To speak against Judge Harmon in Red Oak was not just career suicide, it was a form of actual suicide. The next day, when the news broke that Alara Vance was missing, Garrett called in sick. He stayed in his room for 3 days, shaking, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. The way her head had lolled, the dark stain, the judge's cold, commanding voice. He had seen a murder, and he had seen the cover-up begin. The fear became a part of him, a cold knot in his stomach that never went away. He quit the landscaping job a week later, making up a story about his mother being sick. He took a job at the county sanitation department, a filthy, thankless job that kept him out of sight. He became a ghost in his own life, haunted by what he had seen. He watched as the search parties failed. He watched as Amelia Vance became a hollowed-out shell of a woman. He watched as Trent Harmon's name was carefully, surgically excised from the narrative. And he watched as Judge Harmon became a local hero, the grieving town's steadfast pillar of strength. The injustice of it ate at him, corroding him from the inside out. His conscience screamed at him to speak, but his fear was a gag in his mouth. He was a nobody. He had no proof, only his word against that of the most powerful man in the county. They would crush him. They would destroy his family. So he stayed silent. For 15 years, he carried the secret like a tumor. The guilt and the fear, growing with each passing day, turning him into a bitter, jumpy man who trusted no one and flinched at the sight of a police car. He was a witness who had chosen to be blind, a voice that had chosen to be mute. And the choice had cost him his soul. Leo waited 2 days, 2 days of sitting in his room, the curtains drawn, the drone footage burning a hole in his digital life. He felt like a man holding a live grenade, the pin already pulled. Every creak of the floorboards, every car that drove down the street, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The silhouette on the cliff was a constant presence in his mind's eye. He wasn't just afraid, he was being hunted. He knew it. The feeling was primal, a cold certainty in the marrow of his bones. On the 3rd day, he made a decision. He couldn't go to the local sheriff. Brody. The man was too enmeshed in the town's web of favors and allegiances, a web spun by Judge Harmon. He needed someone outside that web. He drove to the next county, to the state police barracks, a sterile brick building that smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy. He asked to speak to a detective, and was led to a small windowless interview room. Detective Frank Miller was a man who looked like he'd been worn down by years of looking at the worst of humanity. His suit was rumpled, his face was a roadmap of weary lines, and his eyes had a flat, cynical gaze. He listened to Leo's story with a practiced patience, his expression unreadable. Leo explained about the drone, the quarry, the glint of metal. He was careful, deliberate, leaving out the part about the figure on the cliff. He didn't want to sound like a paranoid crank. He wanted to be believed. "A car, you say?" Miller asked, his voice a low rumble. "In Blackheart Quarry, yes, a Ford Falcon, an old one, I think." "I think it's Elara Vance's." Miller's cynical gaze sharpened, just a fraction. A flicker of interest. Elara Vance. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. "You're sure about the car?" "I have the video," Leo said, his hand hovering over the backpack that held his laptop. "It's clear, you can see the make. You can even see something else." He showed Miller the footage. The detective leaned in, his eyes fixed on the small screen. He watched the whole thing without a word. He replayed the part with the locket 3 times. When it was over, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, slow breath. "Jesus Christ," he murmured, more to himself than to Leo. He looked at Leo, and for the first time, the cynicism was gone, replaced by a hard, professional focus. "You did the right thing coming to us, son, the absolute right thing. We'll take it from here." Leo felt a surge of relief, so powerful it almost made him dizzy. He had passed the grenade to someone else. He had done his part. Now the system would take over. The system, however, moved with a slow, grinding indifference. A week passed, then 2. Leo heard nothing. He called Detective Miller's office and was told the detective was unavailable. He left messages that were never returned. The silence from the state police was more unnerving than the silence from the quarry. He started to feel that old familiar dread creeping back in. Meanwhile, the ripples of his discovery had begun to spread, not publicly, but through the town's hidden channels. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody's cruiser pulled into his mother's driveway. Brody got out, a big man who moved with a slow, deliberate ease. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. He ambled up to the porch where Leo was sitting. "Leo," he said, his voice a friendly drawl. "Mind if I have a word?" Leo's heart started to pound. Sheriff. Brody sat down on the porch swing, which groaned under his weight. He didn't look at Leo. He looked out at the quiet street. Heard you took a little trip over to the state barracks a couple weeks back. Heard you showed Em a little home movie you made. The blood drained from Leo's face. How did you hear that? Brody chuckled, a low rumbling sound. Son, in a town this size, there are no secrets. Only stories that haven't been told yet. Word gets around, especially when it involves a name like Vance. He finally turned to look at Leo, his eyes friendly, but with a glint of something cold and hard behind them. Here's the thing, Leo, you went over my head. That's my jurisdiction. That quarry, that case, that's mine. You should have come to me. I thought it was better to go to the state, Leo stammered. Yeah, I bet you did, Brody said, his voice losing its friendly edge. Let me give you some advice. Some things are better left alone. Some wounds are better left to scar over. You go poking at them, you're liable to cause an infection, a bad one. You understand what I'm telling you? It wasn't advice. It was a threat. A calm, folksy, terrifying threat. What about the car, Sheriff? What about Ilara? The state's looking into it, Brody said, standing up. They'll handle it. In their own time. In the meantime, I suggest you find a new hobby. Flying those toy planes, it's a good way to see things you ain't supposed to see. He tapped the brim of his hat, gave a thin smile, and walked back to his cruiser. As he drove away, Leo felt a chilling certainty. Brody wasn't just warning him off, he was reporting back. The antagonist was growing bolder. 2 days later, Leo's mother was fired from her job at the library. The reason given was budget cuts, but she had worked there for 20 years. The librarian, a woman who had been his mother's friend for decades, wouldn't meet her eye when she gave her the news. The same day, the bank called about the mortgage. A payment that had been processed a week earlier was now, inexplicably, lost in the system. They were threatening foreclosure. The pressure was being applied, systematically, cruelly. They weren't coming after him directly, they were coming after his mother, trying to squeeze him, to make him understand the cost of his discovery. The power imbalance was no longer an abstract concept. It was a vice, and it was tightening around his life. The victim, Amelia Vance, was also feeling the pressure. But in a different way. Someone had leaked the news of the discovery to her. Not the police. Not the media. A quiet, anonymous phone call, a muffled voice telling her that a car had been found in Blackheart Quarry, and that it might be Ilara's. The news shattered her fragile peace. The hope she had nurtured for 15 years, the hope that Ilara was alive somewhere, was now locked in a death grip with a new, terrible hope. The hope for an answer, any answer. She went to the sheriff's office, her eyes blazing with a desperate fire. Sheriff Brody was a wall of calm, infuriating platitudes. Now, Amelia, we have to be patient. The state police are handling this. It's a very delicate situation. The quarry is dangerous. We can't just go in there. It takes time to get the right equipment, the right permits. It's been 15 years, she cried, her voice cracking. My daughter is in that water. You have to get her out. We are doing everything we can, he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. You have to trust the process, Amelia. Left the station feeling a despair so profound it was like a physical weight. She knew she was being lied to. She knew she was being managed. The same forces that had silenced the investigation 15 years ago were at work again. Slowing things down, controlling the narrative, burying her daughter for a second time. The witness, Garrett Hobbs, heard the whispers too. At the sanitation department, his co-workers talked about it in hushed tones over their lunch breaks. They found a car in the quarry. They say it's that girl who went missing. Each word was a hammer blow to Garrett's conscience. He knew what was in that car. He knew who had put it there. The fear that had been his constant companion for 15 years now escalated into a full-blown panic. He started seeing things. A black Lincoln that seemed to be parked on his street every morning when he left for work. A man in a suit he didn't recognize, watching him from across the aisle at the grocery store. He was sure he was being watched. They knew he had been there that night. They had to know. And now that the secret was about to come out, they would be coming for him to ensure his silence was permanent. He started drinking heavily, trying to drown the images in his head. Ilara's limp body, the judge's cold eyes. But the alcohol only made the ghosts more vivid. One night, in a drunken, terrified state, he drove out to the quarry. He parked his truck on the side of the road and walked through the woods to the cliff's edge. He stared down at the black, still water, his heart pounding. It was all still there, the whole ugly story, waiting. He felt a sudden, insane urge to scream it all out, to shout the judge's name into the night, to confess his own cowardice to the moon and the trees. But the silence of the place, the heavy, watchful silence, choked the words in his throat. He felt the presence of the judge, of that night, as if it were yesterday. He was trapped. A word from him could bring it all crashing down, but it would bring him down to they would say he was a liar, a drunk, an accomplice. They would destroy him. He stumbled back to his truck, his brief moment of courage evaporating into the humid night air. He drove home, the knot of fear in his stomach tighter than ever. He had a choice to make. He could continue to be a ghost, to let his silence be his tomb, or he could speak, and face the consequences. The conflict was no longer just with the Harmons, it was with himself, a war between his terror and his long-buried conscience. And he was losing. The injustice was escalating, the antagonist was closing in, and the witness, the one man who held the key, was being pushed closer and closer to the edge of a precipice far more dangerous than the cliffs at Blackheart Quarry. The pressure on Leo became unbearable. His mother, bewildered and heartbroken by the sudden, inexplicable collapse of her life, was a constant, walking reminder of his powerlessness. She didn't blame him, not directly, but her quiet weeping in the night was a more potent accusation than any angry words. He was losing. The unseen forces arrayed against him were too powerful, their methods too insidious. He was being erased, his life dismantled piece by piece, all to protect a 15-year-old secret. Desperation began to set in, a frantic, cornered animal feeling. The plot twist didn't come from a hidden clue or a forgotten piece of evidence. It came from a place of grief and fury. Amelia Vance, pushed to the brink by the condescending platitudes of Sheriff Brody and the deafening silence from the state police, decided she was done waiting. If the men with badges wouldn't pull her daughter from that watery grave, she would do it herself. She sold her car, cashed in the last of her husband's life insurance, and hired a private dive team from Atlanta. It was a reckless, desperate act, the last gamble of a woman with nothing left to lose. The news of her intention sent a shockwave through the town. It was one thing for the authorities to slowly, carefully investigate. It was another thing entirely for a grieving mother to force the issue, to bring in outsiders and shine a harsh, public light on Blackheart Quarry. Judge Harmon was furious. The carefully constructed wall of silence he had maintained for 15 years was about to be breached. Not by the police, but by a stubborn, broken-hearted mother. He made calls. He tried to get the dive permit revoked, citing safety concerns, environmental regulations, a dozen different bureaucratic roadblocks. But he had underestimated Amelia's resolve, and the power of her story. A local news station in Atlanta got wind of it. Grieving mother hires private team to recover daughter's body after 15 years of police inaction. The story went viral. The judge, for the first time in his life, was on the back foot. Block the dive now would be a public relations disaster. It would look like a cover-up. He was forced to let it proceed, seething with a cold, controlled rage. The day of the dive was a media circus. News vans from 3 states lined the narrow road leading to the quarry. The townspeople of Red Oak gathered on the cliffs, a silent, watchful audience. Sheriff Brody and his deputies were there, ostensibly to provide security. But their real purpose was to observe, to contain, to report back. Leo was there, hidden in the crowd, his heart a frantic drum. Amelia stood at the water's edge, a small, frail figure wrapped in a shawl, her face a mask of grim determination. Judge Harmon was not there, but his presence was felt everywhere. The divers, 2 men in sleek black wetsuits, went into the water. The silence that fell over the quarry was absolute, broken only by the hiss of their regulators. For an hour, the bubbles were the only sign of their progress. Then, one of the divers surfaced. He pulled off his mask, his face pale. "We've found it," he called out to his partner on the shore. "It's a falcon, all right. It's in rough shape, but it's her." He paused, his voice dropping, and the driver's side door is open. The body's not inside. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Amelia swayed, and a friend caught her arm. Not inside. What did that mean? "But we found this," the diver said. He held up a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside, glinting in the sun, was the heart-shaped locket. The discovery of the empty car and the locket changed everything. It wasn't a simple case of a girl who had tragically driven off the road. This was something else. This was a crime scene. The state police could no longer drag their feet. Detective Miller arrived, his face grim, and officially took over the investigation. The quarry was sealed off. The real twist, however, was happening a mile away, in a dark, cluttered garage. Garrett Hobbs had watched the news report on his phone, his hands shaking. The car was empty. He knew why. He had seen Trent Harmon drag her body out of it. He had seen the judge orchestrate the beginning of the cover-up. They had moved her, but where? The news report, the image of Amelia Vance's ravaged face, the sight of the locket he had last seen glinting against a blood-stained dresset, broke something in him. The fear that had paralyzed him for 15 years was suddenly eclipsed. By a tidal wave of guilt, he had let this happen. His silence had been his complicity. He went to a dusty old footlocker in the corner of his garage. A relic from his teenage years. He fumbled with the rusty latch, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside, beneath old yearbooks and concert t-shirts, was a shoebox. And inside the shoebox was a cassette tape. On the night of the murder, after he had run home from the Harmon estate, Garrett had been a terrified, hysterical mess. He couldn't tell his parents. He couldn't tell the police. But he had to tell someone. So he had told his tape recorder. In a whispered, frantic torrent of words, he had recorded everything he had seen. The falcon pulling up Trent's panic. Ilara's limp body. The judge's cold, commanding voice. He had described the scene in minute, terrified detail, his voice cracking with fear. He told him to get her in the house. The voice on the tape whispered. "The judge, he's covering it up. Oh God, he saw me. I think he saw me." He had hidden the tape. A desperate, pathetic attempt to preserve the truth, and then had tried to forget it ever existed. It was his confession, and his damnation. A record of the moment his life had been stolen by fear. He listened to it now for the first time in 15 years. The voice of his younger self, so full of terror, was like a ghost in the room. It was the voice of the boy he had been before he became a coward. And as he listened, a new feeling began to replace the guilt, a burning righteous anger. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't go to Sheriff Brody. He couldn't even trust the state police. Not after they had slow-walked the investigation. He had to go to the one person who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from the truth. He had to go to Leo. He found Leo's mother's address in the phone book. He drove there, the cassette tape a lead weight in his pocket. He found Leo in the backyard, staring blankly at the overgrown lawn. Garrett looked terrible. He was gaunt, his eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled of stale whiskey and fear. "You're the drone kid," Garrett said, his voice raspy. Leo looked up, startled. "Who are you?" "My name is Garrett Hobbs," he said. "I know what happened to Ilara Vance, I saw it." And there, in the dying light of a Georgia evening, the full conspiracy finally emerged. Garrett told Leo everything. The story poured out of him, a 15-year-old poison being lanced. He told him about working for the judge, about fixing the sprinkler, about the falcon in the driveway, about Trent and the judge moving the body. He told him about the fear, the silence, the years of guilt. And then, he played the tape. Leo listened, his blood turning to ice. The tinny, whispered voice from the past was the missing piece, the Rosetta Stone of the entire conspiracy. It wasn't just that Trent had killed her, probably accidentally, in a fit of rage. It was that his father, the judge, the town's moral compass, had orchestrated the cover-up from the very first minute. He had hidden the body. He had disposed of the car in the quarry, a place he knew would never be searched. He had used his power to silence the whispers, to steer the investigation into a dead end. And he had let Amelia Vance live in a hell of uncertainty for 15 years, all to protect his family's name and his son's future. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer about a tragic accident. This was about a cold, calculated, monstrous conspiracy, orchestrated by the most powerful man in the county. It was about a 15-year obstruction of justice. It was about to become a scandal that would not just break the town, but would reach far beyond its borders. "Why are you telling me this?" Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The tape recorder still playing softly between them because you were brave enough to look," Garrett said, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of shame and relief. "And I've been a coward for too long. They're going to come for me. I know. They are, but I'm not going to be silent anymore." He handed the tape recorder to Leo. "This is the truth. You know what to do with it." Garrett walked away, leaving Leo in the backyard with the tape. The weight of the grenade was back in his hands, but this time, it was infinitely more powerful. He had the drone footage, a piece of physical evidence that no one could deny, and now, he had a witness. And a confession. A confession from the grave, from the night it all happened. The tension had been cranked to its absolute maximum. The next move was his, and it had to be a detonation. The detonation was not a quiet leak to the press. It was a full-scale public immolation. Leo knew that any move he made through official channels would be intercepted and neutralized by the judge's influence. Sheriff Brody would confiscate the tape. Detective Miller, however well-intentioned, would be forced to log it as evidence, where it could be buried in legal motions for years. The truth had to be delivered directly to the people, with no filter, no gatekeeper. It had to be an explosion. He contacted the Atlanta news reporter who had broken the story about the private dive. A hungry, ambitious journalist named Sarah Jensen. He didn't tell her everything over the phone. He just said, "I have a witness and a recording from the night. Ilara Vance died. And I have the drone footage that proves where the car was." The story is bigger than you can possibly imagine. He agreed to meet her, but not in Red Oak. He chose a neutral location, a busy coffee shop in a town 30 miles away. The meeting was tense. Leo brought Garrett with him. Garrett, sober and shaky but resolute, recounted his story to Sarah, his eyes burning with the intensity of a man unburdening his soul. Then, Leo played the tape. Sarah Jensen listened, her journalistic cynicism melting away, replaced by wide-eyed shock. She recognized the story of a lifetime when she heard it. This wasn't just a local crime story anymore. This was a saga of power, corruption, and a cover-up at the highest level of a community. They planned the attack with the precision of a military operation. Sarah's station agreed to run a special, live report, but they wouldn't air the tape. Immediately, they would use it as leverage. The plan was cinematic, risky, and designed for maximum impact. It was designed to force a public confession. The next day, Judge Harmon was giving the keynote address at the annual Red Oak Founders Day celebration. It was the centerpiece of the town's social calendar, held on the lawn of the historic county courthouse. The whole town was there. The judge, in a crisp white suit, stood at a podium, the very picture of civic virtue and authority. He spoke of heritage, of community, of the values that made Red Oak strong. It was a masterful performance of benevolent power. As he was reaching the crescendo of his speech, a white news van pulled up to the edge of the lawn. Sarah Jensen stepped out, a microphone in her hand, a cameraman on her shoulder. They began walking, calmly and deliberately, toward the podium. Sheriff Brody and two of his deputies moved to intercept them. "This is a private event," Brody said, his hand held up. "We have a right to be here, Sheriff," Sarah said, her voice cool and steady. "We're covering the speech, and we have a few questions for the judge about the Alara Vance case." The mention of the name sent a murmur through the crowd. The judge, momentarily faltering in his speech, watched their approach, his eyes narrowing to slits of cold fury. He knew, in that instant, that he had lost control. "I'll have to ask you to leave," Brody insisted, his hand moving toward his sidearm. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sheriff," Sarah said. She held up her phone. On the screen, an audio file was ready to play. "This is a recording from the night Alara Vance died, a witness. I'm sure you and the judge, and his son Trent, would find it very illuminating." Brody froze. The color drained from his face. He glanced back at the judge, a look of panic in his eyes. The judge gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. Brody stepped aside. Sarah and her cameraman walked past him and stopped directly in front of the podium. The crowd was dead silent, a sea of confused and shocked faces. The judge stared down at Sarah, his face a granite mask, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Judge Harmon," Sarah said, her voice amplified by the microphone, clear and ringing across the courthouse lawn. "We have a sworn statement from a witness who saw your son, Trent Harmon, arrive at your home on the night of Ilara's disappearance, in her car. He says Ilara was deceased in the passenger seat." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. People were pulling out their phones, recording. The public spectacle was now a viral event in the making. "That is a preposterous and slanderous accusation," the judge said, his voice a low growl, but it lacked its usual force. "We also have this," Sarah said, holding up her phone again, a recording the witness made that same night. On it, he describes seeing you, Judge, instruct your son to get her in the house and to move the car. He describes a cover-up, orchestrated by you, from the very first moments. The judge's mask finally cracked. A look of pure, unrestrained hatred flashed in his eyes. But he was trapped. The cameras were on him. The entire town was watching. "Do you deny it, Judge?" Sarah pressed. "Do you deny that you hid Alara Vance's body? Do you deny that you dumped her car in Blackheart Quarry? Do you deny that you let her mother live in torment for 15 years just to protect your son?" Every question was a hammer blow, shattering his carefully crafted image. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was drowning in the public square, the truth a torrent he could no longer hold back. And then, the final poetic twist of fate. From the edge of the crowd, two figures emerged, walking slowly toward the podium. It was Leo, and beside him, her face a canvas of grief and terrible righteous fury, was Amelia Vance. She was holding something in her hand, a single framed photograph of her daughter. She walked right up to the podium, past Sarah Jensen, and stood before the judge, the man who had pretended to comfort her. The man who had put his hand on her shoulder and promised her justice. She held up the photograph of Alara, her bright, smiling face a stark contrast to the ugly scene unfolding. "Was it worth it, Alistair?" Amelia's voice was not loud, but it carried an impossible weight. The weight of 15 years of stolen hope. "Was his life worth my daughter's? Was your name worth my pain?" The judge looked from the photograph of the dead girl to the face of her mother, and something inside him, the granite core of his being, finally crumbled. The fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a vast, empty weariness. He looked out at the sea of faces, his friends, his neighbors, the people who had revered him, and he saw only accusation. He leaned into the microphone, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, a confession broadcast to the world. He never meant to hurt her. It was an accident. He has to be protected. The admission, as pathetic as it was all it took. It was over. From the side, Detective Miller and two state troopers, who had been waiting, moved in. They walked past the stunned Sheriff Brody, up the steps of the podium. "Alistair Harmon," Miller said, his voice devoid of any emotion. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and accessory to murder. As they put the handcuffs on the judge, a second team of troopers was already on its way to Atlanta, an arrest warrant for Trent Harmon in their hands. The public justice was swift, shocking, and absolute. Leo stood beside Amelia, watching the titan of Red Oak fall. He had started this with the press of a button on a drone controller, and it had ended here, with the complete and utter destruction of a dynasty, broadcast live for the world to see. The cinematic payoff was complete, a moment of catharsis so profound it felt like the earth itself had shifted on its axis. The secret of Blackheart Quarry was finally, and explosively, out. The explosion left a crater in the heart of Red Oak. The Harmon dynasty, once the town's unshakable foundation, was now a pile of rubble. The trial was a media sensation, a grim and sordid affair that laid bare the rot beneath the town's quaint facade. Trent Harmon, his handsome face, now puffy and pale, confessed to everything. In a fit of rage and rejection, he had grabbed Ia by the shoulders and shaken her, her head striking the car's dashboard with a sickening crack. It was, as the judge had claimed, a tragic accident born of entitlement and fury. But the cover-up was no accident. It was a cold, calculated decision, made by a father to save his son, at any cost. The judge was sentenced to 20 years for his role in the conspiracy. Trent received a similar sentence for manslaughter and his part in the cover-up. Sheriff Brody was forced to resign in disgrace, his career ending in a cloud of complicity and shame. The town of Red Oak was left to grapple with a new identity, one stripped of its benevolent patriarch and stained by a dark and terrible truth. Leo did not stick around to watch the fallout. The glare of the media spotlight was too bright, too hot. He was hailed as a hero, the drone detective, but the label felt ill-fitting. He hadn't been brave, he had been scared. He had just been the one who happened to be in the right place at the right time, with the right piece of technology. He took the money he was paid for the exclusive rights to his footage and his story, gave half of it to his mother to ensure she would never have to worry about a mortgage payment again, and left Red Oak in his rearview mirror. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to go somewhere the sky was bigger and the earth held no secrets. The emotional aftermath found its truest expression not in the courtroom or the news reports, but in a quiet corner of the Red Oak Cemetery. After weeks of searching, guided by the judge's reluctant confession, the authorities found Elleray's body. He had buried her deep in the woods on a remote corner of his family's vast property, in an unmarked grave beneath a towering oak tree. Amelia Vance buried her daughter on a crisp autumn afternoon. The entire town, it seemed, was there. Their presence, a collective act of apology and atonement. Garrett Hobbs was there, standing at the back, his face streaked with tears. He had been given immunity for his testimony, but he knew he would carry the sentence of his silence for the rest of his life. Amelia did not weep. Her tears had all been shed over 15 years of false hope. Instead, she stood at the graveside, with a look of profound and devastating peace. Her long war was over. Her baby was home. The headstone was simple. Alara Vance's beloved daughter, finally at RST after the funeral. After the crowds had dispersed and the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Amelia was left alone. She ran her hand over the cool, smooth granite of the headstone, her fingers tracing the letters of her daughter's name. For so long, that name had been a question, a prayer, a cry in the dark. Now, it was just a name. A memory. She looked up from the grave and saw a single figure standing by the cemetery gate, watching her. It was Leo. He had come back, just for this. He hadn't wanted to intrude on her grief, but he felt he needed to be there. To see the story to its final quiet end. Their eyes met across the expanse of graves. Amelia gave him a small, sad smile, and a slight nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude, of shared understanding. They were the two poles of this story, the mother who refused to let go, and the stranger who had brought her the truth. No words were needed between them. Leo nodded back, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the twilight. His part was done, but Amelia stayed until the last of the light had faded, and the cemetery was cloaked in darkness. She placed a single fresh flower on the grave, a white rose. She thought about the 15 years she had lost, the life her daughter had never gotten to live, the poison of the Harmons' secret. There was bitterness there, a deep and abiding sorrow. But there was also something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Closure. The haunting reflection was not that a monster had been caught, but that the monster had been one of them, a man they had all admired and trusted. The cost of the truth had been the town's innocence, its comfortable illusions shattered forever. The shiny object in the water had been a reflection of a locket. But it had also been a reflection of a community's dark heart, a heart that had chosen to look away, to keep a comfortable peace rather than face an ugly truth. As Amelia finally turned to leave, a cool breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. It sounded, for a moment, like a whisper, like a sigh of release. The ghost of Ella Revance, the girl who had been trapped between worlds for so long, was finally free. And in the quiet, echoing silence of the cemetery, Amelia Vance, the mother, who had become a ghost herself, could finally begin to live again. The echo of the story would linger, a tragic reminder of the cost of secrets. But for the first time in 15 years, the night felt not like an ending, but like a new and quiet beginning.